It is known by many names: the greenback, the buck, the almighty dollar, but its true power transcends nomenclature. For the better part of a century, the US dollar has been more than the currency of a single nation. It has been the lifeblood of global commerce, the bedrock of the international financial system, and the ultimate economic weapon. Its dominance, what French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing once famously called America's exorbitant privilege, has allowed the United States to borrow at rates and scales no other country could dream of. It has financed the most powerful military in history and enabled Washington to project its will across the globe, often without firing a single shot. It was an empire unlike any that came before, an empire of the dollar. But all empires, no matter how mighty, eventually face their twilight. Today, from the boardrooms of Beijing to the oil fields of Riyadh, from the tech hubs of Bangalore to the government halls of Moscow, the foundational pillars of this empire are cracking. This is not a story of a sudden, cataclysmic collapse. It is not a single, seismic event. This is the story of a slow erosion, a death by 1,000 cuts. This is the story of the end of American monetary dominance. To comprehend why this empire is faltering, we must first understand the ground upon which it was built. That foundation was laid not in 1944 at Bretton Woods, but in the chaotic aftermath of that system's collapse in 1971. The Bretton Woods Agreement, forged in the twilight of World War II, had pegged the US dollar to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce, and all other major currencies were, in turn, pegged to the dollar. This arrangement placed the United States at the absolute center of the post-war financial universe. But the costs of the Vietnam War and expansive domestic, Great Society programs led to a surge in US spending and a weakening of the dollar. Nations like France, wary of America's profligacy, began to exercise their right to redeem their dollar holdings for US gold, draining the vaults at Fort Knox. Faced with a potential run on its gold reserves, President Richard Nixon made a fateful decision on August 15, 1971. In what became known as the Nixon shock, he unilaterally severed the final link between the dollar and gold. The world was cast adrift. For the first time in modern history, the globe's primary reserve currency was backed by nothing tangible. It became a pure fiat currency, its value resting solely on the full faith and credit of the US government. This created a crisis of confidence and a profound problem for Washington: how to compel the world to continue holding and using a currency backed by nothing but a promise. The answer was a stroke of geopolitical genius masterminded by then-Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. The strategy was to anchor the dollar not to gold, but to a commodity even more essential to the industrial world: oil. In a series of high-stakes negotiations in 1973 and 1974, Kissinger forged a pact with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the world's swing producer of oil, and subsequently with the rest of the OPEC cartel. The deal was deceptively simple. The United States would provide the Saudi royal family with advanced military hardware, training, and an ironclad security guarantee, protecting their oil fields and ensuring their regional dominance. In return, Saudi Arabia would agree to two crucial conditions. First, they would price all of their oil exports exclusively in US dollars. Second, and just as critically, they would invest their vast surplus oil profits, their petrodollars, back into US Treasury securities. The petrodollar system was born. Its implications were staggering. Every nation on Earth, whether an ally or adversary of the United States, needed oil. To buy that oil, they now first had to acquire US dollars. This engineered a permanent, artificial, and bottomless global demand for American currency. Nations began to accumulate massive dollar reserves to facilitate energy trade and secure their own economic stability. These reserves, held in central banks from Tokyo to Frankfurt, were then overwhelmingly used to purchase US government debt. This created the perfect feedback loop. The world sold goods to America to earn dollars, then loaned those same dollars back to the US Treasury at low interest rates. It was this mechanism that funded America's spiraling trade and budget deficits, allowing the American consumer to enjoy a standard of living fueled by cheap imports and the US government to finance its global military footprint. It was the ultimate exorbitant privilege. But in binding the world's most vital commodity to its own currency, America also sowed the seeds of its eventual undoing. It had created a system that was incredibly powerful, but also brittle and deeply resented. For decades, No nation possessed the means or the will to seriously challenge this arrangement. The US was the sole superpower, its economic and military might unassailable. But the 21st century has brought a new geopolitical landscape, and today, four powerful forces are converging, striking at the Achilles heel of the dollar empire. The first and perhaps deepest cut has been self-inflicted. The United States has increasingly transformed the dollar from a neutral utility for global trade into a potent weapon of foreign policy. Through the aggressive use of financial sanctions, Washington can effectively excommunicate a country from the global financial system. By leveraging its control over the SWIFT messaging network and the network of correspondent banks that clear dollar transactions, the U.S. can freeze assets, block trade, and cripple an entire economy. For years, this weapon was used against smaller states like Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. But the Rubicon was crossed in February 2022. In response to the invasion of Ukraine, the United States and its allies took the unprecedented step of freezing nearly $300 billion of the Russian central bank's foreign currency reserves. It was a financial nuclear bomb. The move sent a chilling message to the rest of the world. Your dollar reserves are not truly yours. They are held in a system controlled by the United States and can be confiscated at a moment's notice if your nation's policies diverge from Washington's interests. For nations like China, but also for middle powers like Brazil, India, and even traditional U.S. allies in the Gulf, this was a terrifying wake-up call. The weaponization of the dollar turned a perceived asset dollar reserves into a potential liability. The search for alternatives, once a theoretical exercise, became an urgent matter of national security. The process of de-dollarization had begun in earnest. The second cut is the strategic and methodical rise of a challenger, China and its currency, the yuan. As the world's largest trading nation and the biggest importer of oil, China has the most to lose from its financial hegemony. For years, Beijing has been quietly building the architecture of a parallel financial system. Its Belt and Road Initiative weaves a web of trade and infrastructure across Eurasia, Africa, and Latin America, creating economic ecosystems less dependent on the West. The ultimate prize, however, is to break the petrodollar's grip. The goal is the petroyuan. In 2018, China launched the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, INE, a marketplace where oil futures contracts can be priced and settled in yuan. While its volume is still a fraction of the Brent or WTI benchmarks, it was a declaration of intent. More significantly, China has been using its immense diplomatic and economic leverage. In 2023, the first-ever LNG trade settled in yuan was completed between a Chinese state-owned oil company and France's Total Energies. Xi Jinping's landmark visit to Riyadh in late 2022 was dominated by discussions of pricing oil sales to China in yuan. The transition is slow. The yuan is not yet fully convertible. China's capital controls are a major obstacle, and the world does not yet have the same level of trust in Chinese financial institutions as it does in the U.S. Federal Reserve and Treasury. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. Every barrel of oil, every cubic meter of gas that is traded in yuan, is another small cut to the petrodollar system. It creates a precedent and builds momentum for a world where the dollar is no longer the only option. The third cut is a technological revolution that threatens to make the entire 20th century banking infrastructure obsolete. The current global payment system runs on rails laid decades ago, most notably the SWIFT network. Based in Belgium but heavily influenced by the US, SWIFT is the messaging system that banks use to communicate payment instructions. Being cut off from SWIFT, as several Iranian and Russian banks have been, is a devastating blow. In response, nations are building their own rails. China has launched its cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, a direct alternative to SWIFT, designed to clear and settle transactions in yuan. Russia has its SPFS, and India is expanding its Unified Payments Interface, UPI, for international use. Even more profoundly, over 130 countries, representing 98% of global GDP, are now in some stage of exploring or developing central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. A CBDC is a digital form of a country's fiat currency that is a direct liability of the central bank. This technology could enable two nations, say, Brazil and China, to settle a trade in digital yuan or digital real instantly, bilaterally, and without ever touching a correspondent bank in New York or the SWIFT network. It's the equivalent of building an entirely new global highway system that completely bypasses U.S. territory, depriving it of its toll booths and checkpoints. The fourth, and perhaps most fatal, cut comes not from external rivals, but from within the empire itself. The very credibility of the U.S. dollar is being eroded by America's own fiscal and monetary policies. The U.S. national debt has exploded, surging past $34 trillion, a figure that is now larger than the economies of China, Japan, Germany, and India combined. The debt-to-GDP ratio has soared to levels not seen since the end of World War II. Simultaneously, the Federal Reserve has engaged in unprecedented rounds of money printing, known as quantitative easing in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Its balance sheet swelled from less than $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion, effectively flooding the world with newly created dollars. While intended to stabilize the domestic economy, this policy is viewed by the rest of the world as a systematic debasement of the currency they hold as their primary store of value. Foreign nations are asking a simple, logical question. Why should we anchor our nation's wealth to a currency whose issuer is accumulating debt at an unsustainable rate and devaluing it through relentless printing? Faith, the invisible bedrock of any fiat currency, is beginning to fracture. The steward of the world's reserve currency is increasingly seen as the most reckless actor in the system. The end of U.S. monetary dominance will not mean the dollar vanishes. It will almost certainly remain an important currency, perhaps even the most important for years to come. But it will cease to be the currency. We are not heading toward a world where the yuan simply replaces the dollar. We are heading toward a multipolar, or perhaps a polar, currency world. A fragmented landscape where the dollar, the euro, the yuan, and perhaps a basket of commodities or a neutral digital asset all compete for influence in different regions and for different purposes. For the world, this fragmentation will likely bring a period of instability and increased transaction costs. But for the United States, it will bring a painful and long overdue reckoning. As the world's need to hold dollars for trade and reserves diminishes, the exorbitant privilege will evaporate. The consequences will be severe. First, U.S. borrowing costs will skyrocket. Without a captive market of foreign central banks recycling petrodollars into U.S. debt, the Treasury will be forced to offer much higher interest rates to attract lenders. This would have a devastating impact on the U.S. economy, crushing the housing market, cratering stock valuations, and causing interest payments on the national debt to consume an ever larger share of the federal budget, crowding out all other spending. Second, Americans will face crippling imported inflation. As the dollar's value declines on the world stage, the price of all imported goods from electronics and cars to clothing and food will soar. The purchasing power of the average American salary will plummet, leading to a sharp and painful decline in the national standard of living. The era of the American consumer binge, financed by a strong dollar, will come to an abrupt end. Third, America's geopolitical power will be drastically curtailed. The sanction weapon, its most effective tool of coercion, will be rendered impotent. The ability to fund a global network of over 750 military bases will be called into question. Washington will face agonizing choices between guns and butter, between maintaining its empire abroad and providing for its citizens at home. In simple terms, America's global credit card will be declined. The bill for 50 years of living beyond its means will finally come due. The empire of the dollar is not collapsing in a single fiery explosion. It is being slowly disassembled, piece by piece, by 1,000 cuts. A yuan-priced oil deal here, a new cross-border payment system there, another $1 trillion of debt at home. We are witnessing the tectonic plates of global finance shifting in real time. It is a transfer of power not being waged with armies and navies, but on central bank balance sheets and in digital payment protocols. To most, the process is abstract, arcane, and nearly invisible. Until one day, it isn't. The world that has existed since the end of the Second World War is ending, and the shape of the world to come is being forged in these financial trenches. The outcome will define the 21st century.